Hey, very good morning and good afternoon. I'm Cheryl CHAN from Linde. Today I'll be sharing with you about Linde's clean hydrogen. Before I begin my presentation, let me just share with you a short video clip.
The hydrogen future is here now, and Linde can deliver it. The company covers every link in the hydrogen value chain, from source to service. Low-carbon hydrogen can support efforts to limit global warming. It has the ability to decarbonize large sectors of the global economy. Linde has the technologies and expertise to unlock the massive potential of hydrogen. The most promising use cases include hydrogen as a low or zero carbon source of fuel for cars and heavy transport, as feedstock gas for chemical chains and refining, and as fuel for direct combustion in steelmaking and similar industries. Linde supports its hydrogen customers every step of the way, from production and processing through distribution and storage to the final point of use. The hydrogen journey starts out with production. At the conventional end of the spectrum, we have gray hydrogen. This is generated by the steam reforming or partial oxidation of natural gas or heavy hydrocarbons. In the next step on the decarbonization journey, we see blue hydrogen. Here, the carbon emitted by steam reforming is captured, stored underground, or reused. The ultimate goal is, of course, green hydrogen. This is made by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, also known as electrolysis, using renewable energy. Today, Linde already covers all production schemes and models. Once the hydrogen has been generated, it needs to be purified. It can then be compressed, liquefied, or fed to a downstream synthesis process. Here also, Linde has the assets, technologies, and capabilities to support every step in the processing flow. Linde's expertise also covers the full storage and distribution spectrum of hydrogen. It could be transported as liquid hydrogen around the world in ships and tankers. The company also supplies the gas by pipeline to chemical and other industrial hubs. In addition, it stores it in underground caverns. Last but not least, Linde delivers bulk liquid supplies to customers with on-site cryogenic storage tanks. Moving along to the actual point of use, Linde is also innovating many hydrogen delivery technologies. These include pump technologies for hydrogen fueling stations and tailored application technologies for the delivery of hydrogen in industries such as metal, glass, refining, and steel. And the list of new and promising business cases is constantly expanding. Think hydrogen. Think Linde.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about Linde's clean hydrogen. And as a start to this, I would like to share with you what we think the status of hydrogen development is, especially around clean hydrogen in the world. So first, I think it's at a point when we think there's a lot of favorable trends that's encouraging this clean hydrogen globally. But of course, there are certain uncertainties that remain. Let's begin with what are the trends that's actually supporting this clean hydrogen that's moving forward. First, I think there's actually very strong commitment and a huge push to limit the carbon emissions globally. Many countries have actually signed up and also made commitments to become net zero, or what we consider carbon neutral, by the time it comes in 2050. And this target becomes very useful because one of the things that it pushes is for the countries and the regions to really start putting together a national roadmap of what it takes to move towards clean hydrogen. Many of them have also put on a lot of funds and grants in order to be channeled to supporting the execution of this clean hydrogen roadmaps. And as this industry starts growing in terms of momentum, one of the very key things that we're seeing is the take-up rates of people that's participating in the Hydrogen Council globally. Over the last 3 years, this numbers has grown from about 13 members to now 92. And this showed that sort of interest levels. So on a very regular basis, many of us will have heard about projects that's being announced, whether it's the public and private sector partnerships. And all this is really important for the industry to move ahead. And as it goes, over time, we will see this transition between the brown and grey hydrogen into some extent of a blue hydrogen and eventually to green. And this entire energy transition is key for the industry. There will come a point when we will be able to reduce the entire cost of ownership in terms of the green hydrogen, and it will begin to fall partly because of the scale of adoption, in particular around renewables, as well as the fact that a lot of technology is being adopted to help in the deindustrialization. But some aspects of it would still have certain uncertainties around it. So take, for example, from a global trend itself, what extent of carbon taxes or what we consider carbon price will actually be sufficient in order for there to be a tipped or sort of a push to move towards a complete blue and green hydrogen. There needs to be an economics around it to make this entire business viable. And I think this will need to come in terms of working hand in hand between the government as well as the private sector. So the industry players will need to have a lot of policy support and probably some new areas of regulations that will allow areas that's not having a strong roadmap in place to move towards this direction. So take, for example, the key powerhouses, for example, the US as well as China. And then what will it need for them to transform towards a clean hydrogen? Of course, there's a huge value chain in the entire hydrogen space, but there would be certain amount of move, beyond the initial hypes that we've seen, apart from all these announcements, apart from MOUs and also a letter of intent between companies and also with the government. What will it take to really execute clean hydrogen on the ground? And therefore, this adoption of green hydrogen as an alternative becomes one of the key thought process as we look towards it. Would it be sufficient to reduce the entire ecosystem towards having enough renewable power that's being put on the ground? I think this is where it brings me to the next point, which is what lies in the natural geography itself. So as you can see, this transition of energy towards grey to green hydrogen will take a lot of things. One, from the government framework, and the other one, what really exists within the countries itself. Some of the natural resources exist today, and in certain countries, so take for example in Australia and some parts of Europe, there would naturally be an abundance of renewable powers. And eventually these countries can also become exporters of green hydrogen to a certain extent. And therefore, we will see, for example, places where there's a lot of solar PV and wind power, there would be a natural geography for green hydrogen from a very start, if there's enough government momentum as well as government support in the entire national roadmap. Then there are others where today they are already considered quite low in carbon footprint. And for those, I think naturally they would continue to have some amount of natural gas in their pipelines, and they will move towards what we consider the blue hydrogen, where there's actually more emphasis in terms of carbon capture and also the utilization and storage of hydrogen. And of course, there will be others, for example, like US itself, there will be a combination of both the blue as well as the green hydrogen. And therefore, the government support and measures become very key in this entire aspect. So the US, the EU, they've put in not only certain targets of where they want to move to, some in the early stage, for example, in transportation mobility, but there's also others where it's more comprehensive throughout the entire footprint. So they would go across the entire value chain. Different industries, different sectors would also have a potential of being part of these investments. And so, Germany has always been taking a very lead front in this area. So in terms of hydrogen deployment, they will be far more advanced than many other geographies. But we're beginning to see this shift as well in Asia Pacific. You have China, Australia, as well as Korea, putting behind a huge amount of efforts, not only defining what it takes in the national roadmap, but really which other players within the industry will make a key differentiator in order to put the country forward in this entire hydrogen deployment. So we look forward to a lot more of all these partnerships and efforts between the government as well as the private sector. And if you can see, what are the different segments or the end hydrogen applications that's very key in this place? We see today, first of all, it's in the very traditional industries where they are very huge in terms of carbon footprint. So take, for example, the industrial feedstocks. You have the refineries, the petrochemical players, as well as the steel mines. But Over time, this will only be a small amount of what we consider the decarbonization that may really take place, because one of the things is hydrogen becomes a very viable alternative for them, and some of it because of their traditional footprint and the technology that's in place, the amount of decarbonization can only move towards a certain aspect. And therefore, the countries that wants to go huge in terms of decarbonization would have to find other sectors which will become a much larger player. Take, for example, one, and in particular in Korea, there's actually a very huge push towards decarbonization using hydrogen as one of the alternative fuels in mobility. And there will be a huge variety of what it is. It can come from the public transportation. It could also be the heavy commercial vehicles like the trucks as well as the buses, and also the commercial cars like the passenger vehicles. We would see this as the entire array of different transportation modes that would eventually move towards it because of the government regulatory pressures and the fact that to some extent electric vehicles would have a certain limit in terms of the advances if there isn't a clear breakthrough in terms of the battery technology and in terms of storage as well as the e-waste management. So we think this might be an early stage for moving into blue and green hydrogen, but it doesn't rule out the possibility once there's actually, chances of, for example, in Korea, they can actually bring in and import huge amount of green hydrogen in order to support that particular segment. But at the same time, there would be other usage, for example, the building and the industrial heating. And how this is going to happen is we look towards first the blending inside the gas networks. So in many of the city areas, there's actually an extensive network of gas pipelines that exist today. And all this, including the ability to do power generation, would be key in terms of how this decarbonization can take place. Some percentage of hydrogen that's being blended in the gas pipelines, today they are already in Europe, they start from about 5 to 10%, but there could also be potential of going higher if there is a possibility of changing some parts of this grid networks and also the boilers that's in place to produce the amount of heating. So by repurposing all these natural gas grids, there is a larger potential for the country actually to move into huge amount of decarbonization. And also in the rural areas where there isn't a dense network, they could also use it for power generation. So we think, this kind of backup supply would be very important for a country as they move towards looking at all the other different opportunity usage for hydrogen. And next, I'll just talk about how Linde can really play in this partnership. As you know, Linde is a key player in the entire hydrogen supply chain, whether it's in the traditional hydrogen or as we move towards the clean hydrogen space. And which color of hydrogen, actually, we're rather agnostic to this aspect because we participate in every part of that value chain. We have partnerships in different aspects of the hydrogen inputs. So take, for example, with natural gas players, the existing ones that have the grid pipelines, as well as we're partnering with a lot more renewable players, whether they are in the wind power or they are in hydropower as well as in the solar PV. So with these partnerships, it just means one thing of moving towards the green technology because we have our own technology in electrolyzers. We've got investments in ITM Power, which actually have what we call the proton exchange membrane electrolyzer technology. And that we believe would be the next front runner in terms of being able to decarbonize by really going fully green. But at the same time, we do have customers who is actually today producing in whether it's a refinery, the petrochemical complexes, they use the traditional technology of the SMRs and ATRs to produce it, but there also lies the opportunity to do carbon capture or CCUS for that matter. And being the leader in this, of course, it brings about that we helped in distribution of the hydrogen that's being produced. And some parts of it, we've got probably the global world commercially viable hydrogen storage cavern that exists in the US Gulf Coast. So all the way from Lake Charles until Freeport itself, we've got an extensive network of pipelines in which all the different oil refineries would be tapped onto the pipeline. And so they could produce this for storage for a good, even up to 10 days of production storage within the hydrogen cavern. And that hydrogen cavern has been in production for a good decade. And of course, we have our next technology, which is around the part of liquefaction. So by producing liquid hydrogen, it is one alternative as well in terms of transportation, because it's better at the lower pressures at which is used for transportation on the roads, but also the fact that as we move towards the city center, this sort of storage may require smaller footprint, less land area, and also it makes it more viable in terms of having a buffer stock for a longer period of time. So these are the different aspects that we've used to do our distribution of our hydrogen today. But at the same time, we bring it to the end application. So take, for example, Linde has got more than in excess of 190 hydrogen refilling stations globally today. And we operate that through remote operation centers as well. So in a very safe way, I think one of the key aspects of operating any parts of the hydrogen value chain is to be safe. And this is one value that we can really bring to the partners and to our customers. And so as I've explained earlier, all the different hydrogen applications that we can take part in, we're building partnerships in different geographies in the world, and we hope to do that as well in Korea. And if I can just end off with some of the different projects that we're beginning to see that's coming upstream. One of it, of course, I have to point out that, in Korea, we've definitely had this hydrogen refilling stations that we've put up with the Korean Expressway Corporation. So we're looking towards installing them by next year. And also hopefully we can distribute more over the years within Korea, because there's such a big push towards hydrogen as a fuel within the mobility space. But at the same time, I think there's also other projects we're working on. For example, the partnership that we're going to work with Hyrdogen to put up the first liquefier project within Korea. And we certainly can look at other projects that we can work towards, not just in Korea itself, but also throughout the world. As you can see, even the ammonia plants, we've got the parts in South Pacific and Australia. We're going fully green, which is putting out a 50 megawatt electrolyzer project. And also the iron and steel industries, trying to help them decarbonize. We can also, because of the small footprint of the PEM electrolyzers, they can be done side by side in existing sites of the refineries. And at the same time, we could also look into putting the energy into the energy grid and the utility space by creating side-by-side network where they're producing. So one, they could tap the renewable power, but at the same time, through electrolysis technology, we could produce the green hydrogen and pump it within the pipelines itself that goes into the utility grid. They could start small at 5 to 10% blending, but over time we see the opportunity to go much larger scale. So for example, the projects that we have with Siemens and also in Europe itself. And I think this is what makes it exciting as an overall technology, and also be a frontier to really bring clean fuel to the market space in the years to come. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.